So let's start by setting a altruistic motivation. So we'll pause and intentionally try to widen our circle of concern, bringing to mind countless sentient beings, bringing to mind the topic of the course, training in compassion. So we think that the purpose of our time is to understand more deeply how to expand compassion beyond our friends, beyond our family, beyond those whose suffering is obvious. Developing the wish for every sentient being to be free of even the subtlest suffering. So try to develop the intention to participate with the goal of understanding how to do that. All right. Any questions from last week or that have come up? So we covered last week, we covered the introduction and we covered chapter 1. Today we'll start with chapter 2. And chapter 2 is related to what I was discussing in the motivation, the idea of extending this compassionate attitude toward those individuals who, particularly that have created difficulty for us. And I would say also too, developing compassion, not just, so the topic of chapter 2 is the idea that adversity is something that we can learn to experience without reacting from a place of anger or aversion. So an adverse circumstance can often be, at least, superficially attributed to the actions of others, but it can also be attributed to environmental circumstances or just sort of happenings in that we're going through that we don't necessarily attribute to individuals and think like, there could be a power outage, or there could be a hurricane, and so those are adverse circumstances, or where we could get sick, or someone, or we could lose our job, and we might not necessarily, we might lose our job, and and not blame anyone necessarily. We might, but uh, you know, it could just be that it's a difficult period or a difficult experience that we don't attribute it to one person or even a group of people. Um, and so, but at the same time, very often we do trace it back to the actions of a person or a group of people. So there's two different ways in which this can happen. And really, we can respond constructively in either situation, either a situation where we are tracing it back to saying, well, I think that this is the fault of what this person has done, or even if we don't um, trace it back in that way, we still want to, like, for example, with a hurricane, um, that is an opportunity. His Holiness in this chapter would suggest that that is also an opportunity to expand beyond what we're experiencing. One, I mentioned, hostility or adversity, or I'm sorry, hostility or um, anger or having, a sense of aversion um, to the experience. And that of aversion, when the experience isn't traceable to a person or a group, that aversion translates into kind of a myopic view, kind of a shutting down. And like with, if if there are layoffs at work and you're maybe one of a number of people, or um, if there's some environmental difficulty or the pandemic or some sort of societal or group experience that you're experiencing and that's difficult for you, but that also other people are going through. When aversion is the response, then, and it's not, we don't say, well, it's because of this person. Still, there's a shutting down of compassion. There's a shutting down of the kind of softening of the heart that is possible if we're not responding with aversion, if we see it in a different way. And so a lot of what His Holiness is talking about um, here are kind of the Lojong teachings. Um, and so there's many different specific antidotes. One of the most powerful, as he says, is the practice of patience. He says, anger destroys love and compassion, and anger is undermined by patience. He says, which is best practiced with an enemy. Without adversaries, you could not fully engage in the practice of patience, tolerance, and forbearance. And so, of course, enemy here can mean a person or a group of people, but, we can also think of, again, these social happenings as like that's the, like taking the economic downturn and thinking of the harm that that's causing in society, like that's my teacher and that's also my enemy. That's what I'm, even if it's not. So we can personify in a way that, and think that in the same way that we need to practice patience with a person or a group of people, we also can and need to practice patience when we can't name a person or a group of people, and yet aversion is strongly arising in my mind. And due to the aversion that's strongly arising in my mind, I'm kind of going inward and energizing the lens of self-cherishing, energizing the lens of, I really deeply care about how this is affecting me, not so much how this is affecting other people, how, my experience of the economic trouble is primary. I'm worried about my paying my bills. I'm worried about paying my mortgage. I'm worried about where my, and no one's saying, don't make sure that you have a job. No one's saying like ignore, like don't do the things that you need to do. But also from a spiritual development perspective, those times are really the best times where we can use that opportunity to make incredible progress, to make the most kind of intense, rapid, because, as His Holiness says in this chapter, when things are going well, it's kind of like we're just sort of skating through life.
Mm-hmm.
We're just sort of, everything, we don't see ourself cherishing, or because, it's just, we don't we're not confronted with things. Everything is just sort of smooth. But when there are these confronting, challenging experiences, then we recognize, oh, this does trigger adversity in me, or, anger or aversion. I don't know why I keep aversion, not adversity. And adversity is the topic, but it's not the mental state. Um, it does trigger aversion in my mind. It does trigger anger in my mind. It does trigger a sense of closing off and going, inward, and kind of um, energizing all of the things that are obstacles to what I want. In the same way that, they say that from a meditative standpoint, um, practicing Tonglen when things are going poorly is the best time to practice Tonglen. Like when you're sick, taking on the sickness of, like, you, of course, because that's when you're least excited, about it. In a way, that's when it's the most difficult. um, when you're having a great day and there's a lot of spaciousness in the mind, and you feel buoyant, then you're like, yeah, let me take on, well, I mean, that also could be, might also think, well, now that's a bummer, to think about, so it's kind of, I mean, it can be kind of both ways. But um if I would say that if a person gets into the habit of doing Tonglen, then I think that they're more likely, because of course now they see the benefits of it, and they're like, they're doing it, maybe once a week, or what have you. For that person, I still think that they're much more likely to do it on a good day rather than a bad day. Um, and so, but all of the great masters will tell us that it's best for us to do it on a bad day, to take, when we are feeling sick, to take on the sickness of others. When we are feeling, you know, frustrated or overwhelmed, to realize that there are countless sentient beings who are feeling frustrated and overwhelmed, and to want to take on the suffering of those sentient beings, to think about, to use that experience to touch the common ground of suffering that all sentient beings are experiencing, and take on the suffering when we ourselves are suffering. Which is different than, I mean, that, of course, that's different than patience, but that's sort of an aside. Um, Again, from a meditative standpoint, patience, and then, so of course, too, there's other ways that we can apply this. That was an example from a meditative uh, standpoint, but also we can confront this, you know, uh, when we're feeling threatened in some way, and we're moving. Kodo, you had a question? You're muted.
I don't have a question, but I have an excellent example of all of this going on in my life. So I'm like, ah!
So, yeah, so did you want to share or?
Sure, you can give me some advice.
Well,
I'll take any help I can get. This perfect example. I do professional caregiving, and I've had a client who is wheelchair bound for the last 6 years. And he's a younger man, he's in his 30s, and his mother's in her mid 70s. And I personally am quite alternative. I'm a body worker and do all these alternative self-care and healing and all that kind of stuff. And they are really American and take lots of drugs and pharmaceuticals and don't take care of themselves. And then they get sick. So recently the mother's been really sick, like with a flu, cold thing. And she doesn't like to wear a mask. So I'm always masked at their house. And one day it's 4 hours, one day it's 8 hours. And so she's hacking and coughing and sneezing, and I'm feeling very threatened. My health is being threatened. And I started to feel anger, like, could you please put a mask on? And she did finally put a mask on. And then I didn't get sick that day, but then a few days later, her son got sick. So I stayed away from work, and they started getting angry that I wasn't coming into work. And I said, well, I'm taking care of myself by not getting your illness because I have other clients. So I went and saw them on Friday, worked my 8 hours. And we were, oh my God. And in my brain, I was like, why don't you guys take better care of yourself? You know, I was really struggling. And I'm at a point where I'm like, I think I should quit. I think I should give a 30-day notice because I'm just like, inside because we have such different ways of taking care of ourselves. And I don't feel like I need to get sick or put myself in harm's way because of their choice of not taking good care of themselves. Yeah, I'm threatened. I feel threatened.
Yeah. I mean, so one, just from a practical standpoint, one way would just be to really be upfront with everybody, and when you're thinking of taking someone on as a client, be like, look, these are the protocols that I we're in a pandemic, and if I'm going to be there, you need to be wearing, I mean, if that's, or if you start to have symptoms of something, then you need to start, and just be like, have it all in writing and put it up front. And then they can decide for themselves, like, is this somewhat, like, if they're an anti-mask, but then they'll just be like, oh, okay, no, thank you. And then, so then down the road, it wouldn't be like, now you figured that out because they didn't know and you didn't know. And now it's a whole thing. If you're just like, this is what's going to happen because I'm at other people's homes, and I have a responsibility to not, infect other people who might be immunocompromised, and so just to set the level of expectation. Um, and then, in terms of, this is something that we have to deal with anyway. I mean, all of us, because we're going into grocery stores and things, and not everyone is going to be and so, if we have an N95 on, then chances are it's probably okay. But still, this is an opportunity to think about, like, well, where does that impulse come from? The impulse that other people, you know, well, it comes from partially that that these scientific ideas have been weaponized for political power, um, in order to sow fear, sow division, to so people um, have been bringing in these ideas from certain political, so that's really unfortunate that um, people have been told misinformation, for and and told misinformation by people who know that it's misinformation, and they're using it to exercise political power and to get control of things. And how sad that is, that if someone is getting that kind of misinformation, and they don't have the skills or the knowledge or the capacity to argue against that, to find other sources of information, that is just a really tragic, because they're the ones who are most at risk, due to falling prey to that. And then also that kind of individualistic, you know, impulse that, well, even a minor inconvenience is too much, for me. So, so then we have to just recognize that that is coming from their side and their perspective, and um, you know that's where the compassion would come from, is to recognize that um, that what's operating in their mind is causing that. Um, any other thoughts or questions so far?
No.
Um, so there's a meditation now in the chapter, so let's do that. So let's try to get into meditation posture. So we keep our feet flat and our back straight, torso open. Hands in the lap, right over left, with the palms upturned and the thumbs gently touching. Our eyes are gently closed or slightly open. We're going to try to adopt a stable, comfortable, upright position without rigidity in the body. So try to relax, letting the body fall into place. And begin to concentrate your awareness in the present by attending closely to the physical sensation of the air moving into and back out of the tip of the nostrils. Noticing quickly when anything other than that one physical sensation is arising in the mind, and without judgment, or frustration, lifting your awareness up from that distraction and placing it gently but firmly again and again on the breath. Then bring to mind a situation where someone acted in a way that was contrary to your goals, your wishes, someone who seemed to be in opposition to what you wanted. And try to remember how you felt, how you responded. Was there a tightness in the mind, a narrowing down, a sense of distance? A labeling of this person as difficult, as the enemy. If these responses were arising, then we can recognize that we've not deepened the habit of patience, the ability to remain peaceful, calm, in the face of adversity. We can recognize the benefit of developing that quality of mind, a mind that looks for solutions, but does so without agitation, without losing sight of love and compassion. We can think that these situations are the only way in which I'm likely to learn how to deepen my compassion, seeing the edges of it, seeing how much further I need to go. Think how amazing. I could go my whole life without that feedback, that knowledge. But now I can clearly see try to imagine what it would be like to dwell in a sense of gratitude for being given that information. My own goal is to develop my potential, and without knowing where I'm falling short, that goal that I've chosen for myself is impossible. So try to go back into that memory and imagine abiding in that state of gratitude. And then when you're ready, we'll come back together. Any questions or reflections or comments? Nope. All right. So we can move on to chapter 3. Chapter 3 is a short chapter, and in it, His Holiness is just talking about what he's been talking about for decades, this idea, his kind of the phrase that he's coined of being wisely selfish. And what he's pointing out here, I mean, of course, I think he phrased it in a really helpful way, but of course, it's coming from the understanding that's persisted in Buddhism for thousands of years, which is, you find that in Shantideva, this idea that um, although, like Shantideva says, although sentient beings want happiness, it's as if they run toward suffering. Um, this idea that we just don't have the methods, that we just don't, that we were kind of fundamentally mistaken. We all want happiness. We all want to be free of suffering. But the problem is that we use methods to accomplish that are mistaken, that don't reliably lead to happiness. We have, we approach things from a competitive scarcity mentality, and so we have this view that, well, if I don't look out for myself, nobody else is going to do it. And so, if I'm up against someone for something, it might be okay to be a little underhanded, or to try to get ahead in ways that aren't, and of course we can progress, in our understanding. We might learn more and more ethical ways of getting, getting what we want. But still there's this view that, I have to just be looking out for myself. And what Buddhism points out, and what His Holiness is pointing out, is that it is that kind of painful, narrow perspective that prevents us from getting what we want. Um, if if instead of, and I think that there are many people who aren't, Buddhist practitioners have who understand this. When you find people who have very little, in terms of, it's really the people who have bought into the kind of narrative of getting more than other people, and keeping, kind of this, the mind of dissatisfaction, the mind of always needing more, always wanting more. But you find, and that's enabled by being, upper middle class or middle class, and living in a society where there's certain values and expectations. In many parts of the world, they're more simple, and that there isn't that kind of comparison because everyone's sort of at a lower level, and that, I mean, there are many societies that are bifurcated in extreme ways, and that, so it isn't to say that there's any place that is free of this, but I just mean that there are many people who have very humble lives, and yet they find it very easy to give, to share whatever it is they do have, to be generous, and to not feel, because they've come to understand that that kind of expansive, generous attitude is what's responsible for their happiness, not whether or not they possess as much or more than others, but that the attitude of the willingness to share and to be kind and to be generous and to be open, that is what is responsible in their own lives for things going well. And so that's what His Holiness's idea of being wisely selfish is understanding, yes, we want to be happy, we want to be free of suffering, but when we put ourselves in the center of our story and we discount the needs of others, then we're setting ourselves up. We think that is the only way to secure happiness. We think that, well, other people aren't going to take care of me if I don't do it, and so I have to be cutthroat. I have to, do these things to secure my own welfare. But what His Holiness says is that when we become known for generosity, when we become, so I mean, even from the tragedy of that perspective is that even from a worldly perspective, kind of a narrow-minded perspective, like just on the level of actual um, safety and security and um, being taken care of, the people who are taken care of the most are people that take care of other people, are people that are known, when a person who's really kind and generous, when they fall on hard times, the people who are, who have been around them and have knowledge of that kind of kindness are very willing to step in, to take care, to provide. Whereas the people who were known to be miserly, who were known to be, unkind, when they're having trouble, the people around them are like, well, that's what you get when, so even from just a social safety net perspective, people reciprocate what we are putting out into our environment. And of course, not all people, not every day, not every situation, but on balance, um, there's a greater reserve or reservoir of goodwill in those around us when that is what we are putting out into those relationships. So reducing self-centeredness, then reducing the egoistic, over, overly exaggerated self-concern, is actually the method not only to get rid of or reduce those painful states of mind themselves, because recognizing that those states of mind are themselves painful when they arise, but also they block the relationships, they block the willingness of other people to work for our benefit. So if we want other people to be willing to be, so that's what his holiness means by being wisely selfish. Being foolishly selfish is the actual self-centered mind, is the mind of discounting others and putting oneself above all else. Tamping that down unlocks not only the really pleasant, kind of pro-social mental states, but also creates relationships that are much more receptive to making sure that we do have enough, making sure that we will be taken care of. And then, of course, like I said, these are also, this is also related to the lens through which we experience our environment. When we have that myopic view of egoistic self-concern, thinking, that is what will protect me, that is what will help me get the right kind of job, get into the right school, get the right opportunities, um, then we actually become really fragile to inconveniences and difficulties. Everything starts to bother us because the world doesn't really care. The world, His Holiness points out that, we have noisy neighbors and there's traffic and, there's a pandemic and, the world is going to carry on, and it's going to present us with things that don't match our preferences, our goals, our interests. And so we become brittle to those obstacles when achieving those obstacles is all that we're considering. Whereas if we can, if when we see others, we find it easy to wish them well, to see them as a complete person in their own, not just a means to our own end, then, when our neighbor is having a party and we would rather be sleeping because it's, 11 o'clock, then we can, the kind of myopic view is just sort of, well, I have to get up at this time and I would like to, but the expand, which, so again, probably this is a situation that, chances are we're not going to go over there and like make a scene. I mean, of course, if there's a real, uh, tendency and it's then maybe, but for the most part, probably we're just going to lay there and be annoyed, until it's over. So we're choosing then to put ourselves through that. Um, and the alternative is, well, we can think, well, I've had days where I was celebrating, the birth of someone or getting a new job or, and I invited people over and maybe I made some noise and maybe that's what's happening for this person. Maybe there's a milestone that they are celebrating um, and of course, we may enforce a boundary under certain, no one's saying that we just have to be a doormat to all situations and at all times, um, but we're living, if we're living in a communal uh, situation, we have to recognize that people are going to make noise and it's not always unreasonable, and just because we're bothered by it doesn't mean that something needs to actually be done. um, But of course, still there's the situation where we may not be able to get to sleep for a time. And then the question is, what am I going to do with my mind between now and then? Am I going to practice um, the habits of just seeing this through my own perspective? Or am I going to take this as an opportunity to rejoice that this other person is celebrating some wonderful event in their life? Um, yeah. Any thoughts or questions?
That's
So
a
go on.
bumper sticker. What am I going to do with my mind?
I was wondering how long of a bumper sticker it was, but then you clarified. I thought, well, maybe I went on for a while, so
That's funny.
it's like a bumper paragraph. But yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you. So chapter 4 is quite unlike chapter 3. Chapter 3 was just kind of like that one idea. Chapter 4 is a bit intense. Um, Chapter 4 is we are our own troublemakers. And really, His Holiness has a tendency, like in every book, to include a chapter on emptiness. It doesn't matter what the book is, there's a chapter on emptiness. And that's kind of what he's doing here, because he's talking about the psychological um, framework that gives rise to these afflicted states. Um, so what he's getting at, and of course, as I said, what he's ultimately getting at is the most difficult topic in Buddhism, um, the the recognition of things. And Justin, we had a day-long retreat today on this topic, the topic of dependent arising and emptiness. So what he says is that this process starts with misapprehending oneself as not being interdependent and interrelated, and existing as a separate, monolithic, completely independent entity. He says this leads to an artificial distinction between yourself and others. And this, in turn, encourages you to become attached to what you see as being on your own side and resist what seems to be on the side of others. This attachment inflates the value of your own qualities and opens the door to pride. And then also, he says that lust or attachment and hatred stem from this exaggerated notion of ourselves as being independent entities, when in fact, we depend on many variables, past and present. And once we put too much confidence in a solidly existing, palpable, overly concrete I, we open the door to discrimination. Once there is I, there is also you. Discrimination is followed by attachment to ourselves and anger toward the other, for we get angry at what foils our desires. So, yeah, I mean, of course, this is a topic that there are hundreds of pages thousands of pages written about in countless treatises and um, so it really just depends. I mean, it just depends. And probably we've all, come across these, all of us here, have come across this in other places. Um, how fundamental ignorance of the way in which, as Justin was saying, it's true that this fundamental ignorance is applicable to both oneself and also external phenomena. So in the historical treatises, they distinguish selflessness of persons and selflessness of phenomena. Phenomena being, you know, anything that's other than oneself, but the emptiness of phenomena and persons is the same emptiness. The lack of inherent existence of a cup is the same lack of inherent existence as the eye. But because the subject of the concretization of oneself is directly related to the arising of other mental states, of negative mental states, taking oneself as the object of negation is the most, generally the most powerful, impactful way. It's true that we realize the same emptiness of all, that when we realize the emptiness of I, we've also realized the emptiness of all other phenomena. But in terms of what we're going to take as the object, taking oneself as the object is the best way to go about that, because it is the I that is the sort of subjective perceiver of the environment, and that subjective perception is really, His Holiness talks about how everything is put into mainly two categories: that which is pleasant and that which is unpleasant, that which I want to be in contact with and that which I want to be separated from. Um, and so because we are on the receiving end, our consciousness, our is kind of what is doing this discrimination. By the fastest, most powerful way to undercut that is to recognize that our identity exists. We do exist. There is a body. There is a mind. But the way in which it exists is different than the way in which it appears. So we don't want to negate too much and go in a nihilistic direction and say, well, nothing exists. It's all just some sort of, completely hallucinatory. Because, as Justin was saying, that, earlier, you can't turn a building into a marshmallow. There is a valid causal chain for the existence of that building, and it's not an airplane. It's not, you can't validly call it, broccoli, but nevertheless, it does not, it appears, the building appears to have an essence. It appears to have a um, a solidity, and it is the solidity that we're negating, not that there's some way of transmuting everything into everything else and nothing has its own kind of unique causal history. That's not what we're trying to uh, overcome. We're just trying to recognize that my experience of the building is solid and fixed in a way that is not how the building actually exists. Um, that the building exists as a dependent arising. It exists solely in dependence upon its causes, the conditions, the parts that comprise it, and then an active mental imputation that apprehends all of those things and then decides to label it, conventionally speaking, due to culture and society and language in a particular way, because it does perform a particular function. A building is something that has doors and floors and walls, and you can go into it. It has some sort of roof, so it doesn't fly. You can't drive it. You can't eat it. So there's ways of distinguishing um, what kind of function it performs. But just because it performs a function doesn't mean that it's independent and set up from its own side, completely divorced from causes and conditions and that active mental imputation, that active mental labeling. And when we, but of course, we fail, it's easier to take kind of cognitive shortcuts. It's easier. Interrogating reality in that way takes a lot of effort, and it takes a lot of you know, kind of forethought and um, deliberation, deliberateness. Whereas we're just kind of caught up. We're just kind of ping-ponging through our day, and things are happening to us, and there's, and so we don't have that spaciousness. We don't have that deliberate, analytical perspective that we can bring to bear on our experiences. And so the world of appearances is easier cognitively. And so we just assent to the world of appearances rather than interrogating the world of appearances. But that's what we do in meditations on emptiness when, things are a bit calmer and, things aren't really happening to us in the same way. Then, and by building up that force of habit, hopefully maybe that translates over to into daily life. That's kind of the premise of analytical meditation, is that by engaging in it over and over again, it changes our experiences outside of meditation. And of course, depends on, it's also not the only thing that the Buddha taught. It's, there are ways of preparing the mind for that insight by calming down. Again, as I mentioned, um, we get caught up. Um, we don't have space in the mind in kind of daily life. We're kind of just getting thrown here and there, and there's a lot of emotional impact to things. And so really everything in the Buddhist path, literally in the Lam Rim, for example, is providing us ways of tamping all of that down, quieting those impulses by applying the wisdom of impermanence, by understanding karma, by understanding, we have these things that we're bringing to bear that are counteracting in a conventional way, in a lesser way, but they're preparing the ground. They're giving us that spaciousness little by little. They are, because it's easier to recognize impermanence than emptiness. And impermanence, but that recognition is still a powerful antidote that we can use And so once we've done that, now the mind is more prepared for the insight into the nature of reality. And that's really the point of how we're being led through the stages of the path, is sequentially kind of preparing the mind for that insight. Otherwise, the Buddha just would have taught one thing. He would have just said, okay, just do this and don't worry about all of these other things. Like, but the Buddha didn't do that. He very skillfully laid out a method, just like, they don't give a first grader um, graduate level textbooks. We figured out, how do you lead a person to prepare their mind for those insights? And it's not just study graduate level material. It's go to first grade, go to middle school, go to high school, go to college, apply yourself, do well, master those subjects, and now your mind is prepared. Now that will make sense. Now you'll be successful. You won't be successful if you just try to skip all of those things and think that, well, this is like what people are saying the point of Buddhism is, so it's kind of all I need to do. That won't work. We have to we have to ripen the mind for that insight, which is why it comes at the very end of the stages of the path, um, or it comes in chapter 4 of this book. So, but uh, so any. So yeah, I mean, because of course, then, as I said, there's also the false appearance of phenomena. Just like we set it in motion by by grasping to a false view of the self. When something seems pleasant or unpleasant, we also believe that it's inherently pleasant or unpleasant. We believe that pleasantness or unpleasantness is a findable characteristic of the object. Um, and that isn't true. Because if that were true, then it's as if objects, when they appear, it's as if they're frozen in one particular mode of appearance. Like a chocolate cake, oftentimes it feels as if it's like a beacon of deliciousness, um, except when we've had too much, and then we look at it and we're actually grossed out. Then at least temporarily, we're having a different experience. Or, if we, when people, maybe in the past, hopefully, when we drank too much, at the time, we thought it was a really enjoyable activity. And then the next day, at least temporarily, we were like, never again. Right. But then that would last for 2 weeks or, 8 days. And then, of course, we'd make the same. And that's not different. That's not subjectively different than any other kind of object. Um, we we might overindulge in all kinds of things and then think, well, I'll be more, but then we get sucked back into the appearance, because we are not recognizing that, we might find, one aspect of that to have some pleasing attribute, but there are all other parts of that it might be bad for our health. um, it might prevent us from this goal or that goal in terms of improving, in term because the food might not be the healthiest food, and so on. um, but in the moment, all of those negatives are not appearing to the mind. It's as if there's just a lighthouse of deliciousness, and it's just kind of the one signal. We're not taking into account the myriad other aspects that are also validly part of the object. And of course, there are people who don't understand why we like a particular food, or because they think it's awful. And so if it was delicious from its own side, that wouldn't be possible. All sentient beings would relate to it in the same way. If it really was just a lighthouse of a particular quality beaming out, and we were just sort of passively noticing that quality because it's being beamed to us from the side of the object, then any other sentient being would have no choice but to also see it in the same way. And that doesn't happen. Some people think that the thing that we think is the most enjoyable whatever, they can't stand it. And we similarly can't stand the thing that they think is amazing, because they grew up maybe in a different culture or with different ingredients, or they were exposed, or they have different, maybe different biology, different, a different number of receptors for a particular thing. Their nose works differently. They smell a different range, or they're more sensitive to certain smells. There's all kinds of reasons why there are differences, but the fact that there are differences undercuts the notion that we have that things are static in their appearance. But again, difficult to bring that kind of introspection when we're tired and hungry and there's chocolate cake, and we're not accustomed to that kind of introspective awareness, because it's a sort of a cognitive shortcut to just be like, chocolate cake good, asparagus bad. It's just, we're lazy. It's kind of a laziness in the mind, sort of a, and so that's why we engage in these contemplations again and again and again, is to familiarize ourselves with a version, with another way of understanding it that undercuts that perspective. Asparagus is pretty good from its own side inherently. And if you disagree, you are mistaken.
That's some serious peer pressure.
So His Holiness says that we should first perceive the object. Well, he's saying, notice how we go about this. Not that we should do this, but try to notice how this unfolds. He says, first we perceive the object. Then we determine if the object is good or bad. Then we conclude that the object's goodness or badness exists inherently in the object. Then we generate attachment or hatred according to whether the object's goodness or badness has been exaggerated. So here he's giving us some entry point into overcoming or arguing against it. Really, that's a bit easier in a way, is to think, okay, just, am I exaggerating the goodness, or like not even really addressing, does it exist inherently, does it not, is this attribute, but then the extent of my reaction is like, okay, I do think chocolate cake is good and the chocolate cake is there, but am I exaggerating that goodness? Is that goodness overwhelming the other attributes of the chocolate cake? And if we can recognize that it's overwhelming the fact that, it's not good for my cholesterol, and it's not in line with what I want for, this or that, in terms of maybe, then we can at least have a smaller piece, or, we don't have it every day, because we recognize that I'm exaggerating. That my relationship isn't fully in line with reality. And in an easier way than trying to figure out whether it is, whether it is inherently existent or not. He says, watch the process by which you make a mistake, by imagining a time when you were filled with hatred or attachment. Does it not seem that the hated or desired person or thing is very concrete? But look more closely, and you will notice a conflict between appearance and reality. Notice how you, again, perceive the object, determine if the object is good or bad, and conclude that the object's goodness or badness exists inherently in the object, then generate attachment or hatred according to whether the object's goodness or badness has been exaggerated. He says, the benefit of insight is that it prevents us from attributing goodness or badness beyond what is actually there. This makes it possible to reduce and perhaps eventually to end lust and hatred, since these emotions are built on exaggeration. This in turn leaves more room for healthy emotions and virtues to develop. So he's saying that, there's hope for tamping this down in a way that doesn't even depend on insight into emptiness. He's saying that we can just start to recognize that there's more to the object than just what about it I think is pleasant or unpleasant. That it has, and again, that's kind of a way of thinking about its parts and its causes and conditions. But it's kind of a easier way, is just trying to recognize that it appears as though it's only delicious, but it definitely has other characteristics, and that I'm emphasizing, I'm caring too much, I'm focused too much on just that one aspect. And then, of course, we can also look at that in other ways, where we recognize that even that appearance of attractiveness or unattractiveness is not as solid as it appears. But that's the end of chapter 4. So a good place to stop for today. Any thoughts or questions? Nope.
Venerable, I think it was very, I just wanted to say, I think it was very helpful when you said that avoid thinking the myopic self-concern will protect us, because then we become fragile to the world's inconveniences. That really says a lot. So I appreciate that thought. Thank you.
All right. So then we'll just dedicate so we can recollect our motivation and feel confident that we've actualized it by listening and participating, and that actualization of our virtuous intent has created positive energy in our minds, and that positive energy will ripen in the future in beneficial ways. But we want to direct it, dedicate it to the ripening of ways that are of greatest benefit to sentient beings. So we think, may it serve as a cause and condition to completely eliminate all painful inner and outer conditions like war and conflict, and poverty and disease, natural disasters, famines. May it completely ripen the minds of sentient beings. May they meet perfect teachers, practice the path, achieve the result of the path, arise in the state of full enlightenment. May I too meet a perfect teacher and practice the path and get the result of the path, arise in the state of full enlightenment, which will provide me the ability to work for the benefit of sentient beings perfectly. I think, may our spiritual guides have long lives. May they be protected from any obstacles. And may I and all sentient beings get hooked by enlightened beings, come under their care and guidance, until we swiftly achieve that state of enlightenment. All right. Y'all need to get some sleep.